It's one of the world's most beautiful cities. A place renowned for its elegance and style, Paris, France. But the story of Paris lies not in its chic cafes or leafy boulevards. The story lies hidden in back alleys, forgotten in cellars, buried in mass graves. It's a tale of extraordinary engineering and scientific endeavor protecting the city from ruin. When Paris is threatened by war, Parisians build phenomenal defenses. When the city's river threatens to run dry, Parisians keep it flowing artificially. When the city is threatened by revolution, Parisians redesign every major street and square to make sure it cannot be repeated. Despite these threats, Paris has survived and prospered through the ages thanks to resourceful technology. Paris, built by people, kept alive by their ingenuity.
We built this city. We built this city.
Paris, capital of France, situated in the heart of Europe. With its monuments, art galleries, and museums, it's become one of the world's most popular tourist destinations. But look again, Paris isn't all it seems. The city can't grow outwards because of geography. It's hemmed in by hills and the River Seine. The city can't grow upwards because of geology. Much of the bedrock beneath the streets is too fragile to support the weight of skyscrapers. The story of Paris is one of engineering and science, preserving a city where no city should be. Sometime in the 3rd century BC, the Parisi, a tribe of Celtic Gauls, built a defensive fortification on a natural barrier, an island on the River Seine. Their fortified village held off all invaders until 58 BC with the arrival of the Romans. The Romans called their new settlement Lutetia, meaning marshland. They transformed it into a typical Roman city, with bridges linking the island with both sides of the Seine. They expanded the Parisian village onto the river's left bank. It's still known today as the Latin Quarter. Florence Saragossa specializes in Roman history.
The Romans were the first town planners of Paris because they knew how to exploit the natural layout of the land perfectly.
The new settlement grew up the slopes of the left bank away from the river and the constant floods that inundated the area at that time. Soon, Roman Paris boasted all the features of their expansive empire, some remarkably well preserved to this day.
Lutetia was a fairly small town in the Roman Empire, but it had all the typical architectural features of a Roman town, including baths.
Roman Paris may have been small, but it was wealthy. 2,000 years ago, this is where their advanced technology was most evident with baths for the elite. Up to 500 people a day would come here to wash and do business.
At the time, these walls were all covered with marble as ornate decoration for the baths. They were always very grand rooms. In the Roman Empire, public baths were important social places. People came, of course, to wash, but they also came to meet each other, to discuss things, or just pass the time. This building, which is fairly big after all, shows the wealth and opulence of the ancient Roman city.
Although it was a regional outpost and not yet the capital, 6,000 people lived here. The Romans built roads, houses, and an arena and laid on spectacular entertainment. In what is today a suburban park in the heart of Roman Paris, archaeologists have found evidence that gladiators once fought for their lives against lions and bears, kept caged and hungry behind these bars. There was capacity for 15,000 excited spectators. But Roman Paris didn't last. In 481 AD, the town was captured by an invading Central European tribe, the Franks, the ancestors of the modern French. 600 years later, Paris has grown. With more bridges and roads, it had become an important trading center, making it more exposed to attack. The Vikings, even the English, all in turn posed a threat. Just before the 13th century, the king, Philippe Auguste, a visionary engineer, devised a simple solution to Paris's defense needs: a wall. Today, in backyards and alleys throughout Paris, traces of Philippe Auguste's landmark engineering project can still be found. The wall, with its 67 towers, was an ambitious project running all around the city, enclosing 675 acres.
There, you can see very well. Look, it's been repaired a bit. You can see some bricks on top of it. That really is one of the old towers from the year 1200, one of Philippe Auguste's towers.
Historian Renaud Gagnon is on the hunt for remaining sections of King Philippe's wall. It's a search that has brought Gagnon into unlikely places, like the garden of this convent.
Bonjour, monsieur. On vient voir le mur. Oui, très bien. Oui, ça va, très très bien.
Alors, le voilà. Attention aux pots de fleurs.
There it is. Mind the flower pot.
Voilà un beau vestige là.
These are some really fine remains that have a special feature. Look here at the slope of the hill. I think it must have been built very quickly, but it's still a wall of cut stone, even though it's uneven.
Attention, surprise, c'est juste à droite.
It's just down here on the right.
In most of Paris, the wall is hidden or been destroyed, but in one part, it's still possible to see its true scale.
You can see this part of the wall really well. It's one of the sections where it's best preserved.
Sur autant de mètres.
Laboriously built by hand using blocks of limestone, the wall is an impressive structure. It stands 32 feet high and 8 feet thick. Every 50 yards stands an imposing watchtower. As Gagnon explains, Philippe Auguste's wall was built to last.
Imaginez-vous la façon dont on a construit le
You
mur.
have to imagine the way they built the wall. They built a first wall of cut stone, like the stone we saw on the tower.
Ici. Là, on fait un autre mur de pierre taillée.
Then they built another wall of cut stone that was separate.
Propre. Et puis, au
And then
milieu,
in the middle, they heaped up just about anything, like rubble, I suppose. In other words, rough stones, bricks, anything that came to hand.
briques, tout ce qui tombe sous la main.
Gagnon discovers one section of the wall tucked away behind an apartment building. It gives a vital clue about how it was built.
Voilà. Alors,
So, just imagine, we're inside it. We're inside the wall. In other words, this outer wall faces the country.
côté campagne du mur. Là où tu es,
There where you are, that would have been the wall facing in towards the city. It's disappeared now.
ville.
In here, you've got, as I was saying just now, all the rubble and junk between the two walls.
Entre les deux murs.
Over the last 10 years, Gagnon has found parts of the ancient wall that have miraculously survived in the most unexpected places.
Alors voilà, vous avez le mur. Ah, voilà.
In this basement car park, 21st century cars are casually parked in front of a 12th century wall. Above the car park, in this concert hall, students listen and play unaware that they're sitting next to a wall that is 800 years old. His city secured by an impressive wall, Philippe Auguste then builds himself the ultimate fortress, a grand royal palace.
Alors ici, évidemment, c'est le château des rois de France. Donc
So this obviously was the castle of the kings of France. It was really the symbol of royal power. It's the great tower of the Louvre. It's the keep of the Louvre that even after its demolition remained an emblem in people's minds.
dans les consciences.
It's a stronghold. It's made of stone. It's impregnable. It's Paris, and it's the King of France.
Et c'est le roi de France.
Today, all that remains of his fortress is a small section preserved underneath the famous Louvre Museum. In its day, it was by far and away the biggest building in Paris, the final defense in Philippe Auguste's massive wall encircling Paris. The centerpiece of his fortress was a tower, 150 feet in circumference and reaching up 100 feet in height. When Philippe Auguste died in 1223, Paris covered more than 600 acres. Drawn by the protection of the wall, people flocked to the city. By the end of the 13th century, Paris was the biggest city in Western Europe. The 300,000 who lived safely inside its wall soon faced an enemy within: drought. The city's water supply struggled to cope. Enter an unlikely band of rescuers, a band of engineering monks. The great French city of Paris depends for its existence on complex feats of engineering, many of them hidden from view. In the 13th century, drawn by the prospect of work and wealth, over 300,000 people crammed into Paris's squalid streets. Unlike today, in the Middle Ages, the River Seine usually dried up in the summer, but it was the only source of water, and it was filthy and polluted. Paris began to run short of clean drinking water. Tucked away behind these suburban apartments stands this unusual bell-shaped tower. It's a gateway to an extraordinary feat of medieval engineering, a network of aqueducts 20 feet below ground. Medieval monks built the aqueducts. Half a mile of their original system remains intact today. The monks had identified a source of spring water, and they cleverly trapped it, filtered it, and sent it along these underground tunnels to the center of Paris.
You can't suffer from claustrophobia if you want to come down here. Most of the people who are enthusiasts about these systems enjoy being below ground in quarries and catacombs, all these underground places. So claustrophobes, I suggest you keep away. We're underneath one of the water inlets in part of the aqueduct. There's a spring here, but it's above the level of the roof of the aqueduct, so it comes out here and falls directly into the aqueduct. The water is collected and it drops, following the slope, to the end of this bit, where it runs down the hill.
The aqueduct was powered by nature's oldest force, gravity.
The water fell onto these steps, which put some air into it, and at the same time broke its flow before it was fed directly down into the aqueduct.
At its peak, hundreds of thousands of gallons of water flowed down these aqueducts every day and into the fountains of central Paris. The surrounding streets still trace the sloping course of the medieval aqueduct. They even named the local cafe after it. It's called the Drains.
This was the only water, other than rainwater or water from the Seine, that was available to Parisians for nearly 5 centuries.
Without the tireless efforts of medieval monks, drought could well have destroyed Paris. However, the water from these aqueducts wasn't enough to provide for a growing city. Water shortages continued to dog Paris for hundreds of years to come. By the end of the 18th century, Paris was still reliant on the Seine for fresh water. Each Parisian could only get just over 2 pints of water a day to drink, cook, and wash with. In modern Paris, they use 500 times that amount. In 1815, the authorities decided something radical had to be done. They ordered this man, engineer Louis-Dominique Girard, to solve Paris's water problem once and for all. What Girard came up with was inspirational and ingenious. It helps to keep the Seine flowing to this day. In the countryside to the east of Paris, a plentiful source of vital water. But it went nowhere near Paris. The question for Girard was how to connect it to the city 60 miles away. His answer, an engineering triumph, a canal linking this rural river to the Seine in the heart of Paris. The canal would supply clean water and be navigable for barges taking food and timber into the heart of Paris. But this dual role only added to the problems. With Paris constantly demanding more and more water, Girard had to make sure his canal was always full. Added to that, each barge that passed through would displace millions of gallons that were simply wasted. The new canal needed constant topping up. Girard's solution, simple and ingenious, pumping stations that took water from yet another river nearby and pumped it into the new canal. That wasn't the end of it. The canal is higher than the river, so the water has to be pumped uphill. Girard wasn't a hydraulics engineer, but he designed and built a machine that still runs today, untouched by modern technology.
Louis-Dominique Girard's machine is unique. One way it's clever is that the water arrives under our feet through a series of channels.
The flow of the river turns two giant wheels that then operate huge pumps that suck up river water into this large chamber. The power of the wheel is then used to power another pump that pushes water into an outlet pipe. From here, it is pumped over 300 yards to the Ourcq Canal, up a gradient of no less than 35 feet. It's a colossal achievement. The canal runs 60 miles through countryside and into the eastern suburbs of Paris, bringing much needed water to the capital. It was directed to fountains in the city center. The ornate decorations had a use. They made it easier to fill up buckets.
The fact that good quality water in sufficient quantities was brought into Paris was a massive step forward for the city and its people.
Without the canal and a network of locks, the River Seine, the vital artery running through the heart of Paris, would almost run dry. Back in medieval times, a lack of water was only one of the many problems facing Paris. Gloom hung over the city. France was locked in a 100-year war with England. This was the age of the legendary French heroine, Joan of Arc. It wasn't until 1453 that the English were driven out. Under a new king, Paris became the capital of France. People flooded in, searching for work and wealth. By 1589, Paris was cramped and overcrowded, the narrow streets barely able to cope. As the city became gridlocked, it was obvious that Paris needed a new river crossing. The king, Henry IV, took control and ordered the construction of this. It's called the Pont Neuf. It means new bridge, the first bridge made of stone to cross the River Seine. The engineering marvel of its day is now the oldest bridge in Paris. Unique in its time, but today Paris boasts 36 road, rail, and footbridges that span the Seine. That's one bridge every 300 yards. Traveling down the Seine is like taking a journey through the history of bridge building. This is the latest, a sleek modern footbridge called the Passa El Solferino. It stands out because it's a single arch made of welded steel over 110 yards long. To support the arch, foundations were dug down into the bank on each side.
We had to dig those big walls down to 23 meters deep. But nowadays we have machines that can do that. It was not the same story with the Pont Neuf.
The components for the Solferino's single arch were prefabricated in a factory and assembled on site. All the struts were positioned by cranes and welded into place.
So the idea that this was that the people would come from the Tuileries, go down by the mouth you see here. They will come down here, go on top of the bridge, and go, as you see them on top, they will have a place on top where they sit, and they go here and go to the Musée d'Orsay. You know, it's more in the fashion today that we love more the countryside than the city, but this city is a great city. We are very lucky to have this river.
With computer modeling, designer Mark Mimram was able to visualize how the access points would work at water level and at street level. These computer models also meant that the minimum of steel was used to make the spars.
So what we did here is to make it as thin as it can be, as transparent as it can be, because of the fact that we could weld it.
16th century bridge builders had no access to modern technology such as this, but they were just as ingenious. The Pont Neuf consists of no less than 12 arches and is 300 yards long. It joins both banks of the river with the island in the middle, the old heart of Paris, the Ile de la Cité. Because of the weight of stone, they had to sink extra deep foundations, not into the bank as with today's Solferino Bridge, but directly into the riverbed. It was a monumental task, only made possible by Paris's ongoing problems with water.
At the time of Henry IV, in summer, there was practically no water in the Seine, so the foundations were built during the summer.
Bridge building on a dry riverbed was much easier. Progress was still slow. The bridge builders were only able to work for 3 summer months a year. As this was the first stone bridge in Paris, they were pioneering their own new construction method.
They erected timber scaffolding onto which they laid the cut stones one at a time, slightly wedge-shaped stones so that they formed an arch. Each arch was built one at a time.
Unbelievably, the limestone from which the Pont Neuf is made didn't come from quarries outside of Paris, but from the bedrock beneath the city itself. In the hunt for stone, Parisians dug out the very heart of the city, leaving a maze of tunnels below. This is just one of them.
The quarry was used from about the 12th century up until the 15th century.
Donc, historiquement parlant, très intéressant.
So, historically, it's very interesting.
The quarries are up to 50 feet below ground. They reveal much about the ancient geology of the Paris Basin.
C'est du calcaire grossier en général.
It's coarse limestone in several high strips. We're in a site that is 46 million years old here. Each time you see a solid layer of limestone, it's a marine deposit from when Paris was underneath the sea. You can see these deposits very clearly here. So the sea seeded and left a layer of rock.
Because of its marine origin, limestone is hard-wearing and resistant to water. The bridge builders had a ready-made supply of the ideal stone for building the bridge. But it was back-breaking, dangerous work in the hot, cramped quarries below Paris.
It was very dangerous. A lot of people were injured. A lot of people died. And that's why a local priest built a hospital to look after the quarry workers injured underground.
How did the stones make it to the surface? Philippe Thévenon paints an extraordinary picture of 16th century quarrying techniques.
The bridge builders ordered what shape of stone they needed. While it was still here underground, it was roughly cut like this and weighed about a ton.
Digging out huge blocks of stone before the invention of power tools required strength and endurance.
They cut along a fault line in the rock. They made a deep cut of about 10 to 15 feet deep. They often did it lying down. And then the rock was cut into on each side. And if the block didn't then fall under its own weight, they used steel wedges to lever into the cracks. Once the block had fallen, it was pushed on rollers to the base of the shaft, where the person at the top would raise the stones up with a man-powered winch.
One by one, every stone for the Pont Neuf was mined and extracted in this way. The bridge took nearly 30 years to complete. For the next 200 years, the Pont Neuf handled an astonishing traffic load. 80,000 people and 25,000 carriages cross it every day. Finally, a road bridge linking all of Paris, making it faster to move across the city. Over 400 years later, the Pont Neuf is still open to traffic. It stands as proof of Renaissance engineering skill. But even the Pont Neuf requires maintenance. Engineers are conducting a major restoration project. Pierre Bauda and his team are cleaning and repairing many fascinating original details.
The masks, they're like grotesque figures that were put there when the bridge was built. I suppose they let the stonemasons leave their mark, and to some extent they look like caricatures. There are 384 masks on the Pont Neuf, including one woman. Well, a head that we think looks like a woman.
Paris is unique in the world because many of its buildings are constructed using limestone that comes from underneath the city itself. It was now the time of France's most famous king, Louis XIV, known to all as the Sun King. In a show of extravagance, Louis built himself a palace 12 miles outside Paris at Versailles, making it the center of his government. He deserted Paris because it was squalid, overcrowded, and rife with disease, no longer fit for a king. As the 18th century drew to a close, Paris faced its greatest ever sanitation crisis. It was almost the time of the French Revolution, but first Paris had to overcome a different bizarre uprising. A revolt of the dead. In 1785, the population of Paris reached 600,000, packed into slums in the city center. Poverty bred discontent and revolution. Houses were packed, poverty rife, sanitation almost non-existent, disease commonplace, life expectancy 40 years. Death was on every squalid street corner. Paris's corpses were buried in a few large cemeteries in the heart of the city, but these were overloaded, stuffed with rotting bodies. Paris was once more on the brink of a public health crisis. The smell was unbearable, and the air thought to be full of disease. The order went out: remove all corpses. No more burials in central Paris. The bones were moved to these disused quarries. Gilles Thomas has written a history of this period.
The first cemetery that was transferred here was the St. Innocent Cemetery. 22 Parisian churches had used it for at least 10 centuries, and it was totally full. The bodies were piled up 10 feet above the level of the street, so that shows how full it was.
What they didn't know was that every rain shower washed through the corpses piled high in the cemeteries, carrying dangerous bacteria through the soil and into the water table. Every bucket of well water was a bucket of poison.
There were bizarre accidents. At the end of the 18th century, mass graves exploded. Some people went down into their cellars and opened the door, and instead of finding neatly stacked wine bottles, they found piles of corpses. So for public health reasons, they decided to empty the cemetery.
Every night for 2 years, gravediggers exhumed the corpses from St. Innocent. Supervised by a priest, it was a grisly task, attracting ghoulish onlookers. The bones were brought here to consecrated underground burial chambers or catacombs, at the time well outside the city's boundaries. The catacombs were created from disused quarries that once provided limestone to build the bridges and churches of Paris. They extend for miles underground.
This place was officially consecrated so it could take all the bodies from all the Paris cemeteries that were emptied from 1786 onwards. The bones were transferred at night. Carts were filled with bones. These carts were then covered with a black cloth. In front of the cart, a priest sung the burial service. It was all done at night so as not to upset the people too much. It's true that the Saint Innocent Cemetery took the longest time because it had been the main cemetery in Paris. They always had the same problem. The first bodies to be taken out were those that had been buried the most recently. They hadn't decomposed, so they had to be taken off to be stripped in lime while they carried on removing the bodies buried below.
As each body was removed, the corpse's identity was noted where possible, the total numbers going to the catacombs recorded.
So this is how the bones were laid out. The principle is the same as a dry stone wall. You form a heap, a stack of long bones. Behind them, you throw in all the broken bones, the small ones. You make a dry stone wall, and you put a mass of bones behind it. The difference is that these walls of bones were elaborately decorated with skulls.
Death wasn't taboo in the 18th century as it is today. No one was squeamish about building decorative walls using millions of bones and skulls. At the time, these catacombs were seen as a dignified final resting place.
Here you are, bones from the Saint Innocent Cemetery laid to rest in April 1786. So these really are the first bones placed here.
Eventually, all the cemeteries of central Paris were emptied. Slowly, carefully, as the bodies of 6 million people were laid to rest in a macabre arrangement, another revolt broke out, this time among the living. In 1789, at the start of the bloody French Revolution, the streets of Paris were in the grip of violent mobs. The famous jail at the Bastille was stormed, the inmates set free. Aristocrats and the monarchy were hunted down, imprisoned, and executed in a horrifying period known as the Terror. In place of the king, France installed a republic, and in 1804, Napoleon Bonaparte crowned himself emperor. Napoleon made Paris grand enough to be the capital of his expanding empire. He built the Arc de Triomphe, the Triumphal Arch, in honor of his military conquests. But it is Bonaparte's nephew, Napoleon III, who is destined to have the greatest impact on modern Paris. By 1850, the population of Paris was 1 million. The city groaned under the weight of too many people in too small a space. Traffic was at a halt, trade static. Emperor Napoleon III, nephew of Napoleon Bonaparte, drafted a radical new plan to rebuild Paris, to build wide streets, improve traffic flow, and clear the slums that fostered unrest and violence.
You had many winding streets, you had decaying houses, overcrowded houses, slums, also the streets were not clean. It was really a city of the old times.
Napoleon appointed Eugene Haussmann as the man to implement his plan. His assignment, to bring Paris up to date and make sure that revolution never happened again. Paris was a network of narrow streets, some with open sewers. There was no running water. At night, these streets were deserted, dark and squalid, everyone too terrified to venture out. Many of these streets were within feet of some of the city's most famous buildings.
Just close to Notre Dame, we have the only remaining parts of what Paris looked like. Now here we see something which is characteristic of the narrowness of these streets. And this was the ordinary width of a street. This was exactly how the streets in old Paris looked like.
These narrow streets were home to hundreds of thousands living in poverty. If Haussmann was to clear these filthy slums, he would have to deal with the people who lived there.
Now, there is also a question. What happens with the people who are occupying these buildings? Where are they going? Haussmann thought, like a majority of the Parisian bourgeoisie, that if they could go to hell, it would be the best thing.
Haussmann bought up the land, moved the slum dwellers to the outskirts, and then turned his attention to the constant gridlock that plagued the city's streets. With the arrival of new railways into Paris, his vision was to link all the main stations with wide boulevards so that traffic flowed faster.
There was absolutely no link between any of these railway stations and the others. And this meant that going from one region of France to another region of France with the obligation to go through Paris meant an enormous effort and enormous difficulties just to come across Paris.
This boulevard was built to link two of the main stations in the north of Paris to the city center. Wide and fast, it wasn't just an expressway. There was space for large sidewalks and trees. With this as his blueprint, Haussmann then carved more large boulevards running up and down and across the city. He built more roads radiating off the Arc de Triomphe, another grand Parisian landmark, and he widened the Champs-Élysées, the most famous boulevard in the world. By easing traffic congestion, Haussmann believed that both Paris and the economy would grow. Paris was a giant construction site. Slums were torn down and replaced by apartment buildings that conformed to Haussmann's specifications. The height of his buildings was exactly 66 feet. Haussmann was only interested in the facade, the look of the long boulevards with their newly built apartments. His concern was to give Paris a modern, uniform look.
There we can see the typical Haussmann buildings with the always orderly shop on the ground floor, then the mezzanine, then the first floor with a full balcony, the second, the third one with small balconies, and then the one which is, let's say, perhaps the most difficult to rent because it's higher and you don't have the elevator when it is built, but you have a full-scale balcony on the top which enables you to benefit the view and also the fresh air.
But Haussmann's grand design had a second, secret agenda. His wide, straight boulevards owed as much to military strategy as they did to urban planning. Little did Parisians know, but Haussmann was about to make their city ideal for soldiers to stop rioting.
The problem of security never has been absent from Napoleon's preoccupations. There had been so many riots with bloodsheds, with destruction, etc., that nearly all the population of Paris really wanted to have security in Paris.
In the middle of this square, in the east end of Paris, a cavalry regiment. Mounted soldiers were in these barracks to control this side of Paris, historically where riots and revolution usually started. But they needed a clear line of sight down this boulevard to communicate with their infantry comrades stationed 3 miles away to the southeast. The problem, this new boulevard needed to cross over the obstruction of a canal that brought water and freight into Paris. A bridge over the canal would have blocked their view and made it easier for rioters to erect barricades and cut off this part of Paris. Haussmann's radical and costly solution was to order his astonished engineers to dig the canal underground for over a mile, so there was no need for a bridge at all. It was an extraordinary feat of engineering, taking just 2 years to complete. There was no electricity at the time, and running shipping through this underground canal in the center of Paris in complete darkness was unthinkable. The engineers came up with an ingenious solution to provide both light and air.
In this tunnel, apart from the few illuminated signs that you can see in front, there's no electricity, no electric lighting. All the navigational lighting comes from skylights, which are cut into the roof. You can see one of them. It's just up here.
These skylights allowed daylight and fresh air to flood in. Like a series of beacons or landing lights, they guided the barges safely down the middle of the canal.
It's very clever and completely up to date. It's in absolutely original condition. Well, it's almost better than that, because it is so well preserved.
In a combination of interests, typical of Haussmann, Parisian barges kept their shortcut to the River Seine in the center of Paris, and the military kept their clear line of sight to prevent riots. As Haussmann's redesigned city attracted more people, he knew that Paris would be doomed if it returned to squalor. So he went to war underground as well. Beneath this fountain, in the very center of Paris, he started to rebuild the entire sewer system. Underneath the streets of Paris, there is a comprehensive system of drains that deliberately mirrors the layout of the streets above.
In each street, we have at least one sewer. Otherwise, sometimes there are two, even side and on side.
These plaques locate the sewers precisely according to Haussmann's new map of Paris. It's impossible to get completely lost. The amount of wastewater can rise dramatically in minutes. The rags over the chains show the astonishing levels that it's reached.
Be careful because it's deep. If you fall in, I can't come and get you.
Where streets cross, there's sewers underground joined to form a massive channel, a fast-flowing river of wastewater powered simply by gravity. Millions of gallons of sewage flow past this point every hour. Smaller side streets have smaller sewers. The sewer channels are also used to house pipes that take drinking and non-drinking water into every building in Paris. With typical Haussmann thoroughness, every house is identified below ground as well as above.
So, here we are, 25 Rue de Lombard. Look, at the top here, we have the drinking water connection. On that side, we know that it's drinking water, and there it's non-drinking water. And this is where the wastewater comes out. Let's move on.
The only other living things down here are rats. They even manage to eat their way through bricks and mortar.
I hear there's a problem at number 17. I guess that it was rats that have dug it out or something. Someone will come and have a look at it and carry out the necessary repairs.
A much bigger hole was dug by an audacious team of thieves who managed to burrow into a stamp dealer's shop before making off with their priceless loot.
Well, they got in there. They dug a hole and got into the basement, into the shop cellar, and so they found the stamps and got back out again.
In less than 30 years, Haussmann dramatically redrew the map of Paris. His new boulevards linked all parts of the city for the first time. He expanded the city's boundaries into new communities to encourage more people to come to Paris. And he built parks, the first time that Parisians had communal areas simply for relaxation. However much Haussmann reshaped Paris, he didn't give the city its single greatest landmark. That distinction fell to engineer Gustave Eiffel. Built in 1889, the Eiffel Tower is the one building that truly identifies Paris. This unique film shows the first images of the finished Eiffel Tower taken in 1900. It is some of the earliest movie footage ever shot. Completed in just 2 years, the Eiffel Tower was a product of the rapid progress of engineering. It was constructed out of steel girders bolted together into what was then the tallest building in the world. It launched Paris onto the world stage. In a frenzy of construction, another bridge was built across the Seine using the same steel and bolt technology. The latest craze for this new super-strong material was combined with flamboyant decoration in a celebration of Paris's historic past. In drawing up his grand plan for Paris, Haussmann expected the city's population to reach a maximum of 3 million. Little did he know that even in modern times, the growth of Paris would once again be threatened by war and invasion. In 1940, Paris suffered a final humiliation. The city was invaded once more. In a twist of fate, crack troops from Hitler's Nazi Germany marched down Haussmann's wide, straight boulevards and into the heart of Paris. During their 4-year occupation, they left the buildings largely untouched. But when the Germans withdrew in 1944, Hitler ordered that Paris be razed to the ground. The commander of the city refused to obey. As U.S. troops liberated Paris, they found it just as Haussmann had designed it. In the post-war years, Paris grew into a desirable and chic capital city once more. Below ground, there are now metro and high-speed commuter trains linking the capital with the suburbs. Above ground, the city looks almost frozen in time. Its streets and buildings a glorious reminder of the work of Eugene Haussmann. Until this. A 40-story skyscraper built in the heart of one of Paris's oldest districts in 1972. Called the Tour Montparnasse, it's Paris's brave attempt to embrace the 20th century.
At the time it was built, everyone hated it. Probably because it's not a very good architecture, and certainly because it's not in the right place. And the problem is that because of this tower, it became absolutely forbidden to build another tower in France.
Dislike of a single building brought the skyscraper dream to a dramatic end. If the rules change and Parisian planners want to build upwards, they'd find it difficult. Underneath the city are thousands of disused quarries that once supplied limestone for the buildings of Paris. Underground Paris has been likened to a block of Swiss cheese, so full of tunnels that the bedrock is too fragile to take the foundations needed for skyscrapers. So all of Paris's tall buildings are outside the city in an area called La Défense, an exclusive sanctuary reserved for modern architecture.
In La Défense, Paris built everything he didn't want to see in the center. Very few dwellings and a lot of offices and commercial centers.
Since the Second World War, successive French presidents have left their mark on Paris. They didn't build high, but opted for controversial. 30 years after it was opened, the Pompidou Center, with its elevators and air conditioning on the outside, is still the most talked about and visited building in Paris. The daring glass pyramid in the courtyard of the very regal Louvre Museum. Paris is built and sustained by feats of engineering now hidden from view. It's engineering that has helped to transform a wild, seemingly uninhabitable site into one of the world's most glamorous cities. It's engineering that has helped build walls for protection, trapped and filtered vital drinking water, bridged the mighty River Seine, and conquered disease. Paris, renowned for its elegance and beauty. kept alive by ingenious engineering.